interrupt this program to bring you a special birthday message for our minister, Gary. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday to you.
Enough embarrassing Gary, and now back to Gary.
Welcome back to our thought for the day. It's lovely to have you back with us again. Last week we did a few silly things, and I'm sure we'll get back to being a bit silly in the coming weeks. But this week I wanted to focus on one particular theme. A few years ago I became a school governor at F&B infant school here in Sawbridgeworth, and I remember one of my first meetings once I became a governor being given a pack of paper. It wasn't quite as big as that, but it was still a fair size, and in there were lots of documents and policies about the school, things for me to go over and get my head around. But there was one sheet of paper which was a glossary of terms which became quite important, quite invaluable during my time. It had lots of acronyms and abbreviations that helped me understand what they were talking about when they talked of SIPs and things like that. And so they were really useful, and it helped me understand the language of being a school governor. And I'm convinced that when people become Christians, one of the first struggles they have, or one of the things that may even put people off thinking about becoming a Christian and entering church life, is the language we use. We use words that perhaps regular society doesn't use. We talk of the devil, we talk of God, we talk of worship, fellowship, and things like that. And they're words that people haven't used or perhaps unfamiliar with. And there are two expressions I want to focus on just this afternoon for a bit that are maybe unfamiliar to someone who isn't a Christian, isn't yet a Christian, and maybe takes a bit of getting used to. The first one is the word gospel, and the other one is the phrase good news. You would have heard Christians speak of believing the gospel or sharing the gospel, preaching the gospel. Christians also speak of good news. I want to tell the world the good news about Jesus. And these two terms are actually related to each other and actually quite important. And that's what I want to focus on for a little bit this afternoon. Both those words, gospel and good news, are actually from the same Greek word. The New Testament is written in Greek, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. And the Greek word that they're both related to, they come from, is a Greek word called evangelon. And this Greek word, evangelon, can be translated good news or gospel. And they have the same thing, and used many times across the New Testament. What's really interesting about this word evangelon is that in classical Greek, it refers to a message that brings victory, a message of victory. It also refers to a political or personal message that brings great joy. And actually what's really interesting is that word became almost exclusively used by New Testament writers, and then really it's become almost exclusively a Christian term to describe the life, death, resurrection and ascension and soon return of Jesus Christ, the gospel or the good news. The gospel is essentially a message of victory, a message that brings joy, victory at the cross over the death and sin and darkness that we all see, and a message of joy that we can be forgiven for our sin, that we can have everlasting life, and that when Christ returns, we can be taken home, taken to everlasting glory in heaven. And so the gospel, which I want to focus on this morning, is really referring to the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. And I want to ask just two questions this week. And the first one I'm going to hopefully answer today, and the second one we're going to spend the rest of the week exploring. The first question is, what is the gospel? And then the second question is, why is it good news? I want to read just a few verses from the beginning of a book called Corinthians, the first letter to the church in Corinth. And this is what Paul, the writer here, says. He says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you've believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he has appeared to Cephas and then the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as one abnormally born. And those few verses I've just read really sum up the gospel, or the good news of Jesus Christ in a nutshell. He came, he died for our sin, he was risen from the grave, and if we trust and put our faith in his death, we have not believed in vain. We have something to hope for, and he is with us forevermore. We have an eternity, a hope that goes beyond the grave. Those verses I've just read from 1 Corinthians 15, 1-8 are that evangelium, that gospel message in a nutshell, talking of his death, his resurrection, reminding us that this is the centre point of human history, when God's Son should die for every single one of us. And that is what the gospel is. Our world was so lost in its sin and brokenness and darkness that God loved the world so much he would send his only Son 2,000 years ago. The everlasting, eternal Son of God took on flesh. He went to the cross. He was nailed with his hands and his feet. He took all of our sin, all of our brokenness was taken off of our shoulders and placed on his. He was covered in our filth and our dirt and our unrighteousness, our brokenness and our shame. He paid the price, the ultimate cost, going into the tomb, only to be risen from the grave in victorious, glorious splendour. He walked out of death so that we can have everlasting life. That is what the gospel is. Jesus being our perfect substitute, dying our death, paying our price, so that we can be washed clean on the inside. There's been lots of talk over the last few days of things that might wash things away. The blood of Jesus, the Bible tells us, washes away our sin. That's what the gospel message is. And I want to spend the rest of this week just looking at how that is good news and why it's good news. So I'd like to finish with a short video that just talks of how the good news of Jesus can change us and change our hearts. But God bless you. Have a fantastic week. I'll see you again tomorrow.
My heart was born a blank slate, ready to be written on, to be filled up with the language of love. That's what I believed. I was wrong. My heart was a rock, an unmovable object, a stone temple for loving only myself. My heart was untouchable, unable to give, unable to feel what mattered most. But then you spoke to it. You spoke of a love that bleeds. You wanted my crumbling heart. You changed it, and it began to feel, and it began to hurt. The sorrow of my stubbornness burned. I wished to be stone again. And then you spoke your love again, more loudly still. And suddenly I knew what my heart was for. I gave it to you. I asked you to keep it. You filled it with praise. It ached with longing for you. My joy flowed over, even into my sorrow. Finally I began to notice hearts of stone all around me, a world full of lovelessness, a million hearts that needed yours, and mine broke for them, as it never could have before. You brought it to life, and gave me the words to tell them, of a love that turns hearts of stone into hearts that beat for you.